I myself was sick with chronic fatigue syndrome
Good evening,
for
Earth. This
almost
is Adam
8
Sturch,
years. I was
broadcasting from the
severely
Mushroom
ill.
Mansion.
And your book, When the Body Says No, was
Taos, New
a huge
Mexico.
piece of my recovery.
Working on oil
Thank
painting
you very much for
Olympus.
that. I also wanted to let you know
Alright,
that
tonight
I'm
I've got
mind
a
body coach now,
pretty
and I'm
wide
teaching within a
variety of
healthcare
colors
system here
set
in
up
BC.
to block out
Through Dr.
the main
Arsenault,
colors
I
in this
teach-
composition. I want
I
the
teach
horse
the
to be
patients
sort of a
in the-
bright
in the
yellowish,
BC
the figure to be a
system
violet blue,
Yeah,
the
through
demon
Dr.
snake thing to be
Arsenault, he's the top chronic fatigue
red.
doctor in BC.
The angel will
And
be
then
kind
I'm
of
gonna
fleshy,
be teaching
sword
Dr.
light blue.
Hyams, who's the top
And then
pain doctor in BC
we'll see
as
where
well.
we go from there.
And a lot
Oh
of what
yeah,
I
in the
teach is
background
new
I've got some
material,
really nice
so
sap
I
green
wanna say
to
thank
make
you
up
very
sort of
much,
a
and I
dark
wanted to let you know
mountainish
that it
range
is
and
coming into the healthcare
then
system.
illuminate it with some white.
It is
So here we
happening
go.
very slowly, but BC is like the forefront of this, and I'm so happy to be part of that. My degree is from SFU in public health, so I'm very proud to be teaching your work. My question is, the myth of normal actually was the first time I heard about how there's the genetic change in the telomeres of in the cells.
It's not a genetic change, but anyway, go on.
Sorry, epigenetic change, I suppose. Yeah, epigenetic change in our telomeres caused by trauma, which then leads to chronic illness. And I'm wondering if a better way to get in with the med students is by using that biological approach. Obviously, you have so many outcome studies proving this, and it hasn't gone anywhere in terms of getting into the system. Do you think that biological approach might be easier to get into the system?
Well, look, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that there's all these biological studies that are not being utilized or even noticed by the medical system. It's not for lack of information, it's not for lack of studies, it's not for lack of physiological evidence. So telomeres, as this questioner mentioned, is the structure at the end of our chromosomes. It's like the aglet at the end of my shoelaces. It keeps the strands together. So telomeres keep the strands of DNA together. And we're born with about 10,000 units, and when we die, we have about 4,000 units. So they wear off and they unravel with age. As they unravel, we unravel. And it's been shown repeatedly that the more stress people experience, or the more racism they experience, or the more, or say their mothers or chronically ill children, the caregivers of the designated caregivers of Alzheimer's patients, they have shorter telomeres than their chronological age. So their biological age is older than their chronological age. And this is true for black people in the U.S., just because of racism. What more proof does anybody need? It's been published and published, and just that, by the way, you know what's really interesting? Is they looked at the telomere length of medical residents, and they shorten faster than other people their age. They're under tremendous stress, and that chronologically ages them. But what more research is required? So it's not that the biology doesn't exist, it's just that it's not considered. You're quite right though. You're trying to appeal to the medical mind, and if you have the opportunity to do so, bring in the biology. There's lots of it, lots of it.
Thank you. We have another question over here, behind you.
Yeah.
Good evening. Dr. Murphy, congrats on your award. I was introduced to your work because of my experience with the father of my granddaughter. This young man is still in the doorways on the east side. Struggles with addiction, and I needed to understand what was going on. I feel a little better informed, but at the same time, I'm very disheartened when I hear about these medical professionals that come to you as an aside and tell you that they see what you're experiencing. how does one, and this unfortunately happens in many fields, the frontline workers are not consulted. So how does one get them on board, or the bureaucracy which is behind the scenes? Thank you.
Yeah. I understand what you're asking. Last week, I gave a talk here in Vancouver to 1,700 frontline workers in the housing field, and in the public housing field, social housing, and they work with the most vulnerable and traumatized populations, people mentally ill, people racialized, people traumatized as children, addicted, and so on. And I raised that very point. And I asked them, how many of you felt, or how many of you experienced that what you see and what you understand is not appreciated or seen or taken into account by your leaders, by the people at the top. And there's just this buzz of agreement sweeping through the room. I got some emails afterwards. And unfortunately, systems are designed not to change. And the people with the most vision, understanding, depth, and compassion are the least likely to make it to the top. That's how it works. Hate to give you bad news, but that's how it works. Because people at the top want short-term results, they want efficiency, financial restrictions, and criteria that are laid down from the top. So in this democratic society, so-called, there's nothing democratic about the institutions in which people work, including and especially in the public, no, not especially, but including in the public health field. I don't know how to answer your question. I wish I knew, but here's the deal, David E.B. never calls me up for advice. Justin too never phones me for advice. None of these people do. Every once in a while, I get a politician surprisingly telling me, oh yeah, I get it. I just can't talk about it. So I don't know how to answer your question, except keep the faith. You keep doing it, saying it, speaking it, and hope that at some point it's going to finish. But I don't have an easy answer to your question, so.
I have a question at the very, very back.
But you know what? Let me just say one final thing. I'm sitting here in the audience, and I won't identify him. He's a former patient of mine from the downtown east side, whose life was at risk much of the time, with infections in his body that threatened his very survival. His addictions were compelling and chronic, and it was like a prison. He's free now, and he's healthy now, and he's okay now. So you don't give up on anybody, including your relatives, your son. You don't give up on anybody, okay?
So we have a question at the back, and then we have a question over here on the left. We're just getting the mic turned on. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. McKay. My name is Michael. My pronouns are he, him. I want to say that in a more positive attitude, that I'm a delegate at the BC Federation of Labor Convention right now.
Yeah.
Last convention, I stood up and spoke at the mic about the medical model versus the social model, because with respect to that, in the past I was, diagnosed with mental illness and also addiction.
Mhm.
So right now I'm 27 years clean and sober, right? But I spent many years in the medical model system where there was, given medication and such, right? But it wasn't until I was given the ability to expand into the social model and take more CBT, DBT type treatments that I was able to use mindfulness and other techniques to reduce anxiety, depression, and things like that, to come out of that, if you know what I mean, so that I could be able to come out of my other addictions and things that grew from that. So I'm just saying that I do have connections with some politicians, and we're trying hard to try and build in the social model into the public health system. But right now, what our biggest problem is that the funding is only for the medical model, right? Like you're talking about. We can only get medication and psychiatry for our mental health illnesses.
Yeah.
But if we could get the social model treatment funded by the provincial government, that could help a lot of people. So we're working hard to try to get that done.
Okay, is there a question
Yes, the question is, would you be able to help us with that situation?
here? Yeah, just call me in my spare time. I'd love. Listen, thank you for that statement, and if anybody in any position of authority or engaged in the work wants to contact me, I'm really happy to be contacted. I'd love to continue that kind of work. And I'm encouraged to hear that you're working on it, and that you might have some political allies willing to support you. By all means, just reach out. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question here on left.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mate. You mentioned earlier that the question you wanted to hear from doctors who were sending for you was, is this true?
Yeah.
If this is true, what we did.
Yeah.
But I would really appreciate if you could speak a little bit to the why is this true? Do you feel that this is coming, that this sort of deep commitment to duality, this refusal to accept the kind of things that you're talking about?
Why is it that people have trouble accepting it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and do you see it only as sort of a systemic rigidity, or do you see it as the result of a kind of unwillingness to accept the political implications of what you're saying?
Yeah.
And I just would appreciate if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, there's the Western mind, which is dualistic almost from the very beginning. 2,400 years ago, and I said this often, but Plato, the Athenian philosopher, quoted Socrates, his teacher, as saying that the problem with the doctors of today is that they separate the mind from the body. So this dualism is one of the lights on Western thinking. And it's only been reinforced since the onset of capitalism and technology and industry. And that famous statement by Descartes, what I think, therefore I am, so that there's no unity there. So, that's going to be ingrained in the Western mind, as compared with Eastern and indigenous ways of understanding, which is far more about unity and oneness. Now that, you have to, of course, give the Western mind its due. It's responsible for incredible achievements, insight, technological innovations, medical progress, unimaginable. So we're not dismissing it or denigrating it, but it is dualistic. So one thing is the ingrained habits of the Western mind, and the making the left intellectual brain the master of the Gestalt, holistic, right-sided brain. In other words, making the masculine dominant over the feminine. So that's another source. Then, because of the incredible achievements of Western medicine, we become the victims of our own success. We think that we know everything. Or what we don't know is not worth knowing. So we don't look in other directions. Then there's a very arrogant colonial mindset. Because basically, Western capitalism establishes dominance by destroying native cultures. So that, which had to be made to seem inferior. So the Western mind is colonized by its own arrogance. And when I go to indigenous communities in this country, there's so much wisdom when it comes to healing. So much. But we don't look at that. There's that. Then there's the more practical considerations that institutions are have a lot of inertia. You've been practicing medicine for 20 years in this dualistic way. It's very hard to let go of that identity and just admit, there's a lot I don't know. You just carry on with what you know and what you're expert at. And then there's the training of medical doctors. As somebody once said, how do you build a cult where you separate people from their families, you sleep deprive them, you give them a uniform, a jargon only they can understand, and put them under authority and leaders. That's how you build a cult. In other words, you send them to medical school, which is a highly traumatizing experience for a lot of people. And doctors talk about this, some of them, very openly. And finally, probably not exhaustively, but finally, there's the influence of the pharmaceutical companies who funds research, those that will profit from it. That's what's presented in a lot of the medical journals. There's no profit to be made in talking to people about their traumas and their stress. But there's a profit to be made by making a pill that will mitigate the effects of the trauma and stress. A lot of profit. So the biological psychiatry and the biological approaches, there's a built-in bias in the whole research industry, purely related to profit. So there's all that, and maybe more.
We have time for one more question, and I shall go to this side of the room, at the very back, wearing a hat. I'm sorry, we have limited time, and we knew we would not get through all the questions. Please do join the book signing. Please do come to the event afterwards, the reception, and we appreciate your patience and forbearance for not being able to ask the questions that you wish to have. So one last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Maggie, and I'm very, very glad to be here, and I'm a big fan of you. I'm a therapist, and so I do agree with a lot of things that you're saying, like almost everything you're saying. And there's one thing I think I got concerned is that when I see my client who living in the world that becoming increasingly chaos, like for example, like Donald Trump got reelected and they got super stressed and over all this. And I want to say, you want more controversy, that can be taught. But my question, it will be even for me or for my client.
Actually, an engineering creature, so we take in raw material and we excrete ideas in the form of works of art, engineering, and culture, and that this tendency will find its
The last question, that lady's crackers. Sorry, Gene. I hate to cut you off. The response is brilliant, but she triggers me in an unpleasant way that I'm not willing to work on while I'm painting. Fucking
we will build cultures which are art. And of course, there is a dualism between art and nature. Of course, the earliest space colonies is already being planned. They will attempt to emulate the ecology of Hawaii as exactly as possible.
But for anybody else that's listening that's curious about that, that's the end of the Q&A on Gabor Mate's talk Silver on my playlist. It's an award ceremony.
Because it's such a challenge to the science of ecology to be able to create and maintain ecosystems of large size and balance. We really don't know how to do that. Obviously, we will learn how
time we got like 8 minutes in.
We can build it however we wish. And this will be a great challenge to do. Because, yes. Yes.
Zoom, zoom. Alright, it's working pretty well. Let's do that real quick. That worked more.
Yes, it's a historical point of view, a two-category view of reality. Everything is either good or everything is bad. It is hopelessly simple and thinking us to overcome simplicity by going back to a one-box system where you don't try to divide everything up. Yeah.
Alright.
Before I answer more questions, which I hope there are more, I just wanted to
Let's see.
read you a couple of things to give you the flavor of some of this stuff. The first thing I'm going to read is just a small portion of the document comment. And this is comes out of that body of Gnostic literature that is most closely related and comparatively with Christianity. This is from a document I mentioned, which is older than Luke and Matthew, and
Cool.
is in a uncertain
Alright,
few documents from the stories of Thomas the Israelite, the philosopher, concerning the works of the childhood of the Lord. I, Thomas the Israelite, tell unto you even all the brethren that are of the Gentiles, to make known unto you the works of the childhood of my Lord Jesus Christ and his mighty deeds, even all that he did when he was born in our land, whereas was this. This little child, Jesus, when he was 5 years old, was playing at the ford of a brook, and he gathered together the water and flowed there in the pool, and made them straightway clean, and commanded them by his word alone. And having made soft clay, he fashioned thereof 12 sparrows, and the Sabbath, and he did these things. And there were also many other children playing with him. And a certain Jew, when he saw what Jesus did, playing upon the Sabbath day,
develop it all more,
he
but
parted straightway and told his father Joseph, Lo, thy child is in the brook, and he hath taken clay and fashioned 12
I'm
little
gonna use that
birds,
same
and hath polluted the Sabbath day. And Joseph came to the place and saw and cried out to him, saying, Wherefore dost thou do these things on the Sabbath, which it is not lawful to do? But Jesus clapped his hands together and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, Go. And the sparrows took flight and went away chirping. And when the Jews saw it, they were amazed and departed and told their chief men that which they had seen Jesus do. But the son of Ammon, the scribe, was standing there with Joseph, and he took a branch of the
Okay,
willow and
now.
burst the one Jesus was gathered together. And when Jesus saw what was done, he was wroth and said unto him, O evil, ungodly, and foolish one,
Okay.
what hurt is the fool in the water?
Second take here.
Behold, now also thou shalt be withered like a tree, and shall not bear neither root nor fruit. And straightway that lad withered up wholly. But Jesus departed and went unto Joseph's house. And the parents of him that was withered took him up, bewailing his youth, and brought him to Jesus, and cursed him, for that thou hast such a child which doeth such deeds. And it goes on. Eventually he straightens the guy out. But not before he zapped 2 more people So it's an example of
Okay, I'll come back for a second take after a short break. Take two coming up.
Word, even in the formulation
Okay, take two.
of our language, they're talking about God. Now, let's talk some more about it. Yes. Well, in that Valentinian thing, she was 36, but there were other versions where she was 12, somewhere she was 365. Some of them were like declension. For instance, I'm loath to speak of this in the presence of experts, but in Hinduism, there is the notion of tattvas, and I believe there are 36, at least in one formulation. Anyway, they start out very ethereal and general principles, like I think the first three are word, object, and cognition, and they have a special relationship to each other. But they are essentially descending categories of greater and greater boundedness. I think in the Hindu way of handling it, you come halfway down and you've reached the subtle earth, and then you descend the rest of the way down till you reach the gross earth. But there were various ways of interpreting these archons. The signs of the zodiac is one way. They were gods of time, and they controlled sectors of time. So that, for instance, in one aberration of Marcion's system, there were 365 of them. Obviously, they were day demons of some sort. So these were the things which were interposed between, and it was a matter of, in late Gnosticism, you see the question of magic loomed here very large, because first of all, the general mental set of the Hellenistic world is favorable to magic, but a thoroughgoing Gnostic analysis would lead you to the conclusion that magic is ineffective, that only gnosis can lead you to salvation. But in the late period, this became unclear to the practitioners of Gnosticism, and so they proliferated extremely complex magical systems of words, basically, and ritual, we assume. But really, the only artifacts of Gnosticism that we have are carved gems, which are talismanic gems, usually with these archons depicted upon them. The casting of horoscopes was tremendously important in Gnosticism, because that showed your fate, and they took astrology probably more seriously than anyone has ever taken it, because they were so caught up with the machinery of cosmic fate. Taking a book from the Egyptian cults they contacted that were worshipping Osiris and Hermes Trismegistus, they have the notion of words of power, and they thought that as you threaded your way up through these cosmic shells, there were gateways, and you would be expected to have the correct spells, the correct words of power, the correct talismans to let you through to the next gate. And these gates were moving in constant relationship to each other, and there were moments of propitious death when more than one gate was lined up with another that you could just shoot right through. So they really were very contradictory. It's the richness of it. Had they analyzed their own position more clearly and been more doctrinally consistent, they wouldn't have been nearly so interesting. But their own anarchy, their own devotion to, it was really a cult of individual responsibility, which certainly I tried to connect to the psychedelic experience, because I don't think it's valid without a sense of individual responsibility. And then it was a cult of this secret knowledge, which was vouchsafed from within. And I want to say something about the logos in this, because many of you have heard me before know that I associate the spoken voice of the psilocybin mushroom with the logos spoke gnosis, but it was not the same logos as the Platonists. For the Platonists, the logos was the world soul. Actually, the demiurgos itself. For the Gnostic, it was a way of gaining information from the higher and hidden All-Father using the soul as an intermediary. But in both Platonism and in Gnosticism, there's contact with an interior voice through contemplation, which is giving true knowledge, was a mystery that was practiced and was very real. One of the wonderful things about Valus is he talks about, this is Philip K. Dick's book that I urged on you all, is he talks about the Logos as a creature of pure information, and believes that it actually came, or suggests that it actually came to Earth at a certain moment in time, around the time of the death of Alexander, and that it was a creature of pure information which could actually form a symbiotic relationship with a human being by being known. In other words, here was something which when you found it out, it began to live inside of you. And he called this the homeoplasmate. The union of man and gnosis was the homeoplasmate. And of course, suggested that Christ was one of these people, and suggested that that the Gnostics were not kidding when they said that that the inner initiates of the cult were superhuman in some form. They had this symbiotic informational energy creature living inside of them. And then he suggests that this was the reason for stamping it out, that it represented a form of symbiotically fused humanity that was just unacceptable to anybody who didn't have anything to do with it. So that then at Chernoboskin, at the monastery, whatever it was, at Nag Hammadi, these cultists found themselves surrounded. They were essentially the last people to have the complete message of the Logos, and they wrote it down. Now, since it was a creature of pure information, writing it down didn't destroy it, it only froze it, as if you were to put something into a deep freeze. So they wrote down this information and froze it. Then everyone who was a homeoplasmate died. He was killed, something happened. But the stuff was in the ground until 1948. And now, if you desire to become a homeoplasmate, you need simply read this book, and it will begin to grow in you. This is a slightly insidious slant on the notion that if you will plant but one mustard seed, but it takes it literally. It says, our faith is a living faith. Take it within you and let it grow, and it will, as though they were actually speaking of something which had a replicatory power beyond that of a simple doctrine. It is a fanciful description of Gnosticism, but I'm sure that it comes closer to the feeling of what it must have been, because they were really trying to inculcate this thing in themselves which would grow and change their view of the world by giving them an entirely new kind of information. Very similar. It's almost as though taking the mushroom and having its experience is to have it grow within you. That would be a very Gnostic way of describing it, to say the mushroom is growing within me. That's why I feel as I do, why I experience as I do. It's a faith, which is a physical thing, which is intermingling and interpenetrating body, mind, and soul. And this is how they conceived it. This is what they hoped for it at its best. Yes, anybody else? Yes, in the back.
I've heard a lot of scientific novels, and he is, to put it mildly, rather paranoid. How much of his worldview of things in Valus is
So he wrote books more paranoid than Thales. If the final conclusion of paranoia is negative, I think the whole Gnostic thing is totally paranoid. I mean, the idea that God has abandoned you, that there is not one single clue in the entire universe about what to do about it, is a pretty paranoid view. I think that as far as Dick is concerned, I think books like The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch are a much more disturbing kind of view. I actually thought Valus was an optimistic book, although you might differ after you've read it.
I also noticed he had something in there that was a point where he claimed that the early Christians or some flavors of them possessed some kind of, could, I assume, consume some sort of, perhaps mushroom, perhaps something, and then sort of, to use a computer hacker term, dump themselves into this little symbol, and then they float around, they'd be sort of frozen in this little symbol, and then the minute someone 10 years later came down and looked at the symbol, they would sort of, they would sort of all of a sudden get two personalities.
Well, yes, that was a vehicle that he used in Valus. I think the book that comes closer to his view on these subjects, which is also worth reading if you have an interest in Gnosticism, is the Transformation of Timothy Archer, which is not science fiction, but which is a novel, thinly disguised novel about James K. Pike, who, if you will remember, was Episcopal Bishop of California in the 60s, and his son died, and he began receiving messages from his dead son, and presented a tremendous mess to the Episcopal Church, because they had to come to terms with this, and they did by having a heresy trial, and he finally died by dehydration in the desert near Qumran, and he had parked his car by the side of the road, taken a bottle of Coke and a road map, and walked out into the desert, 115 degrees, and was dead. And the book claims that he was close to the people who were unraveling the Nag Hammadi material, and that what was coming out of it was the notion that Christ was the follower, get that, the follower of a person named the Interlocutor, who lived 70 years before Christ, or 35 years before Christ, about whom nothing is known, but that the I am statements, the so-called homiletics of Christ, were actually statements drawn from this earlier source. Well, now this is a slightly hysterical version of what came out of Nag Hammadi and Qumran, but not that hysterical. There is enough material to suggest that Christ was someone's follower, and that what he was saying had been said a generation earlier by someone else of whom we have no trace. And this is hot, hot stuff, because it just cannot be that way if you're Orthodox. And but anyway, this was what Dick felt about Pike, whom he knew very well. And if the Transmigration or Transformation of Timothy Archer is an excellent book to read to see how modern churchmen have dealt with this. It's scandalous that the Nag Hammadi library is not more widely discussed, because it represents the strongest doctrinal challenge to Christianity in its history. There's never been anything this explosive, because it casts such doubt on the moment of the origins, and such doubt on whether or not we have any contact with the career of a Galilean who was the son of a carpenter, and so on. It just seems to explode the entire foundation of Christian hermeneutics. And there's excitement in the schools of theology. They are totally aware of this, but it doesn't seem to have filtered down to the lay level, and perhaps it never will. It may be like the Grand Inquisitor. This thing coming out of the ground is the most unwelcome thing that could appear on the scene in modern Christianity. It fouls it up hopelessly. You realize when I refer to the Grand Inquisitor, I mean the scene in the Brothers Karamazov, the story of Christ returning to a city in which the Inquisition is happening, and his dialogue with the Grand Inquisitor, who knows full well that it's Christ that he's talking to, and who explains to him that he shouldn't have come. They have things well in hand. It's only going to make a problem. Any more questions? Yes.
Would you be willing to give a sketch of the conclusions you reached earlier about psychedelics in history?
Well, I by earlier, you mean before I got here this evening? Conclusions I reached about psychedelics. Well, I think that that this experience of true knowledge coming unquestioned from the outside, for modern people, at least for me, is only accessible through psychedelics. The experience of the logos, the experience of a speaking voice, a voice in the head which clarifies reality and directs moral activity. See, the New Age model for psychedelics has become shamanism. It's just fallen together that way, and there's probably no undoing it at this point. But only a small portion of shamanism worldwide utilizes psychotropic plants. In my personal opinion, it is the kernel of shamanism. But these other traditions may have as much to say about it. And I believe, that knowledge of history is like knowledge of your own life. You are partially amnesic if you don't know what happened in the 15th century, the 12th century BC. I mean, not that I know all these things, but I feel badly that I don't, and I'm working on it constantly, and it's good for you. It's no mere exercise. You actually do become more grounded as you find out who you are. And you recall earlier I mentioned the Gnostics said, whither have we come, whence are we going, who are we, and into what have we been thrown? And it seems to me a clarion call to the study of history, if there ever was one. So I illuminate the psychedelic experience because I guess I have the Platonic faith that time is the moving image of eternity. And what the psychedelics are doing are standing you in eternity in what Thomas Aquinas called the nunc stans, the standing now outside of time. And outside of time, you see all of history. What is that poem? I saw eternity the other night like a golden ring. Well, what you must see when you see eternity is all history at once. Well, it becomes important then to be able to interpret it, to know what slice of the mandala you are getting. And I don't know if you personally are familiar with psychedelics. If you're not, it must sound like a preposterous thing to say. But if you are, you know that historical movies are not at all uncommon, and that you dial up places and times and styles and motifs, and that it shows them to you. And I think all of these past ideological, as I said before, these noetic artifacts that we dig up and show each other. Here is the Osirian religion. Here are the sayings of Nagarjuna. here is Marcion and his system. These things are aid us in formulating our own understanding. I think that the great wrong turning of modernity is the abstraction of explanation from experience, so that we have tremendous explanatory engines at our command, Boolean algebra, quantum physics, but they nowhere come tangential to experience, so that they are always like institutional faiths. I mean, who has ever seen a quark? Who has ever seen any of these things? And what we need are maps of the world true to experience. And at first, they may seem very quaint because they will be hundreds of years old or drawn from some bizarre religious or cultural tradition. But that is just the patina on the outside. When you knock off all the rough spots, as Hans Jonas did with Gnosticism, you discover Heideggerianism. You discover, that what first appeared very quirky and quaint and removed from our concerns is actually central. So I really think that the psychedelic meditation par excellence is the recovery of lost historical time. I think William Blake lined up behind that when he said nothing is lost in eternity. And this is the idea that if nothing is lost, there must be a point to recovering it. Shaman, by the way, do not have history. Isn't this a strange thing? They couldn't possibly follow my prescription because it assumes a literate tradition. What they have reference to are the great oral cycles that have been handed down to them. The two things are not that different, but we really need to recover the power of myth in our own lives. And it's very hard to know even what that means. What it means is we need to begin to have theories of being that are true to experience. And taking of psychedelic drugs pushes this to a crisis level because the notion of experience becomes so expanded in the presence of psychedelic drugs. That's why I said, a physics of experience is what's needed, and very hard to imagine what that would be. It would be a physics which would explain to you why the world is as it seems in fact to be, rather than a physics which explains to you that the world is, wave packets moving at sublight speeds according to these tensor equations. It's a perfect explanation, except you can't find people in it anywhere, or the scale from which you are doing the observing. And so it's a task of 500 or 600 years to move away from a trend so overwhelming. But I think psychedelic drugs will be central to it because they decondition you from receiving doctrine from above. In other words, there won't be state faiths handed down. Everyone will be expected to make sense of their reality and to have a theory to lay back on their reality, which makes it more real to them. It's all about personal responsibility. And that's, I think, the major message of the Gnostics, that they were taking responsibility for their situation in the world, in a way in which these other Hellenes were not. They were running after less thought out ontological positions. Just, your everyday run-of-the-mill sort of religion. But the Gnostics were going much further. They were trying to come to grips with experience and being. They were very modern. This is why these moderns like Jonas and Rudolph and Heidegger and all these people have gone back to them so fruitfully, because they really formulated these things. Yeah. It seems to them absolutely self-evident, and I think that must mean that
3 months.
it was really a chaos in the Hellenistic world.
All right, I'm going to do a
So
third
many
take.
people To them, it was as obvious
Victory.
as it is to us that the world is a mess. I mean, if you were to ask the reasons for modern alienation, it's because well, we see that life is cheap, that politicians can't be trusted, that priests are scoundrels, that everything has played us false. And I think they felt that way. There was a real sense of loss and wandering. I mean, the great pinnacles, Rome was infected with a sense of its own vulgarity. That's why the empire spoke Greek. That's why everybody who was educated in Greece, the empire was vulgar. And people who were intellectuals knew this. And they knew that it was based on human subjugation of other people, and that it was basically not a hopeful situation. It seemed obvious to them. And that's why I think it was a proletarian, largely radical, dissident kind of thing. It didn't make great inroads into the aristocracy. Yeah.
Is there a way in which history is part of the state base? I mean, if that knowledge comes down, comes up?
You mean that history is distorted for the purposes of the state? Yes, that's right. You're exactly right. But what confounds that kind of thing is every once in a while, something like these urns full of texts come along where it's like, you remember the old ads for the Rosicrucians where the cowled priests are saying, this knowledge must die? Well, that knowledge, probably from the point of view of many, many people, should have died. The Nag Hammadi library, having once gone into the ground, should never have come out again, because now it challenges our faith. Yes, history is normally part of the state's machinery of repression. That's right. Well, I don't know, many people have said it, perhaps Hitler most recently, that history is the story told by the survivors. But you see, it isn't true in this case, because the survivors were all Christians. They thought they'd handled this matter at Nag Hammadi. But 1922 years later, it returns, and it outlived the survivors. The knowledge could not be destroyed, and now it's being spread throughout the world, and its great enemy, Christianity, is now 2,000 years older, too senile, too uncertain of itself to grab James Robinson and burn him at the stake and come and find all of us and stamp this out. So, yes.
Along the same lines, it's possible, this is a psychedelic view again, to take the same approach to what is given to you as history from the state and reinterpret it. An excellent example of that would be early Minoan Crete. The discovery was made at the time with a certain view of how Mediterranean cultures work was a stand in the archaeological community. And a lot of conclusions were drawn on that basis, that if you go back to the original evidence, which is very good archaeological work, you can come to completely different radical conclusions. And some people are willing to do so.
I might suggest, by the way, that that was done after reading about the culture of the state religion and getting many of the artifacts that we could by pictures in full color pictures. And then using psychedelic drugs over 2 or 3 separate occasions and trying to see what those images meant. And the meaning was a lot different than what the immediate meaning was a lot different than what was written by scholars of the late 19th century or 20th century.
That's right.
So it takes a lot of research and work before you utilize drugs.
That's right. Well, Gnostic studies are now in their infancy. A great deal of work has to be done to assimilate all of this. This is why, in a sense, the occasion for this lecture was the publication of this book, Gnosis, by Kurt Rudolph, who one of the foremost scholars of Gnosticism, but the first to integrate the Nag Hammadi material into a book like this. Hans Jonas's book on Gnosticism, which is a wonderful book, is now slightly outdated because at the time he wrote it, these things that from Nag Hammadi were only partially translated and understood. But yes, it's the uses of history are many. Any more questions? One more question?
Well, I just want to throw out that,
Yeah.
sometimes people do things like that, that sort of challenge the standard way, a way of thinking sort of pop up out of nowhere, like John B. and I got a hold of the library manuscript on microfilm, and then looking through my marginal training notes, and that seems to sort of, his sort of ideas about the world seems to sort of challenge lots of sort of, standard Christian theory, and also even standard occult theory. In fact, I didn't understand. It seemed a really in-depth thing that the Golden Dawn actually managed to sort of somehow integrate it into their practice. It seemed in some ways totally different.
Well, he doesn't spring ex nihilo. He is part of a long tradition that was thin at times, but largely underground. I mean, there are only two strains, or I will say there are only two strains in European magic, the schools of Dee and the schools of Bruno. And everything can be traced, everything after them can be traced back to them. Both Dee and Bruno can be traced back to Henry Cornelius Agrippa, who was the student of Trithemius, Bishop of Sponheim. So we know that we get it at least back that far. But yeah, Dee is an interesting case, and in a certain sense, Gnostic in temperament. I didn't talk tonight at all about the relationship of Gnosticism to what is normally called Hermeticism. Hermeticism is the alchemical tradition. It sort of straddles the middle between Orthodox Christianity and Gnosticism. It had the notion that there might be a redemption of the light from matter through manipulation of matter, and through that laid the grounds for modern chemistry. And the Trismegistic hymns, the writings of the Corpus Hermeticum offer, I think, a bridge out of the extreme nihilism of Gnosticism, and it's still not Christian by any manner of means. I wanted to mention just one last thing, which is simply a notion or an idea. I mentioned Mandaeanism and its clarity and its psychedelic sensitivity to biology. I think that it reached its clearest expression in a cult about which very little is known, but which I think would be an interesting object for study. It's called the cult of the peacock angel. And the peacock angel is a hypostatization of some sort of this biological they, Hibble Ziwa. But it sounds like a psychedelic cult. And I don't know if the people are here tonight who are the Soma people who look at Pergamon Harmala, but I would think that based on doctrine, if you were looking for an Iranian cult that had a psychedelic sacrament based on Harmene or Pergamon Harmala, that the cult of the peacock angel would be an excellent one to look at, and it still exists, or perhaps these areas are so screwed up politically now. I mean, it existed in the hills of Lebanon until recently, perhaps. I want to thank you very much for coming out on Holy Saturday night. Perhaps I'll tell you one more story to remind you of the strangeness of the Gospels themselves that we accept so much. so easily. You know, it's a cliche, of course, that the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is the most Gnostic text in the New Testament. And in fact, the entire Gnostic faith is basically set out there in principio et verbum et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was made nothing that has been made. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness grasped it not. And that is the formulation of the Gnostic cosmology, that the light shone in the darkness, but the darkness grasped it not. And the Latin word is, I think, comprendena. Anyway, it is the Latin word in which to grasp is also to understand. It's essentially that the darkness could not comprehend the light. That is the best known instance of Gnosticism in the Gospels. The instance I want to point out to you that you can take away and meditate on its meaning as a koan, if you wish, is that on Easter morning, when the women came to the tomb and found the stone rolled away, I believe it was Anne, I'm not sure which one, approached the Lord as if to touch him. I think this is in Mark. It's only in one gospel. Somebody knows. Anyway, and Christ said to her, "Touch me not, woman, for I am not yet."
Thought that might have flipped on my camera. I freaked out. There's a splatter of yellow that just went somewhere. In this direction. Not my new big painting either. Oh, I'm a little more careful. I hit the ceiling.
It would have been weird enough had he said, "I am not yet of the nature of the
Well,
Father."
anyway, I think we're
But
about that.
touch me not seems even more suggestive. Thank you very much for your attention to a difficult subject.
Solely upon mathematical considerations. Since the computer-derived classification of results was no better than the clinical cluster one, and since using the skandhas made more sense intuitively, the Buddhist classification system won out. Other groups have since used the HRS and confirmed its usefulness in measuring other altered states of consciousness, drug-induced and otherwise. Buddhism also helped me make sense of people's DMT sessions. Its far-reaching perspective includes all experiences, spiritual, near-death, and even non-material or invisible realms. However, I did come up against two serious limitations in my lack of Buddhist education. How was I to respond to a volunteer who spoke as if she or he had just undergone a drug-induced spiritual experience? Was it a real enlightenment or not? As detailed in Chapter 16, Mystical States, these sessions certainly left me feeling as if something deeply profound had happened. And there was no question on the volunteers' part that they had undergone the deepest and most profound experience of their lives. However, it was beyond my training and expertise to determine the validity or certifiability of a volunteer's understanding.
All right, so
Psychiatric models
that blocks in the basic colors, and we'll go from there. So that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Olympus. Have a good night, Earth.
Versions of Buddhism possess a full roster of demons.